Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next webinar in the Job Search Essentials series. Today we are talking about the interview process. My name is Desiree Williams, and I serve AKSI as the Digital Education Coordinator, and I will be producing this webcast. And before we dive into the content, let's review the web-based features available to you. This webinar will be advanced remotely, but at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use throughout the program. If you are accessing the webinar via a mobile device, you may need to scroll down or over on your screen to see these widgets. Each window on your screen is also customizable, so feel free to resize and move them to fit your needs. A copy of the slideshow and other additional materials are available in the green resource list widget for you to download. The group chat is available for you to interact with other attendees and the presenters during the presentation. When posting, it will share your first name and last initial, but please share your chapter and university as well. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget with the question mark icon. And lastly, if you have a question throughout the program, please type that into the Q&A widget. All questions will be discussed at the end of the program with our presenter. The job search process can be daunting, especially as a graduating senior or a recent grad, but the process itself is only a few steps. Prepare your materials, search for open positions, apply, interview, and accept the offer. In our previous webinars in this series, we explored tips for creating resumes and cover letters, as well as searching and applying for open positions. Today, we will focus on the fourth step. For more information, be sure to check out the other webinars in the Job Search Essentials series. So let's focus on today's conversation. The hard work isn't over once you submit your application. Getting an interview is really just the beginning. During this webinar, we will review the interviewing process, including preparation, do's and don'ts, and best practices to present yourself and your abilities in the best way so you can secure an offer. For our program today, Bailey Stilley will present. Bailey joined the Theta Sigma chapter of Alpha Kappa Psi at Texas State University in 2012. While at Texas State, she served her chapter as secretary, pledge trainer, vice president of membership, and president. In December 2015, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in marketing with a professional sales concentration. A bronze DSA recipient, she began volunteering her time as a regional manager for Northern Rio Grande in 2016. She lives in the Central Texas area where she volunteers as a team leader for the annual Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Great Strides Walk. Bailey currently works for ADP in their Human Capital Management Outsourcing Division in San Antonio. And now I'll hand it off to Bailey to get us started.
Thanks for the introduction, Desiree. Now, before we dive into some tips and do's and don'ts of interviewing, let's talk about the process first. So there are a lot of steps that must occur before you get to the actual interview. The process starts with submitting an application, which also has a number of prerequisite steps for the applicant, including writing a resume, writing a cover letter, and sometimes securing references if the application requires. Now, until this point, the applicant is in control. You have the ability to design your resume and write your cover letter however you want, as well as include the experiences you wish and then submit it whenever you want. Once you hit that submit button, however, the company, particularly the HR department, takes control of the process. Depending on the position and the size of the company, the time span between each step can vary greatly. Once you submit the application, however, someone, likely the recruiter, will review the applications and select whom they wish to interview. Sometimes companies will send a letter to those not selected explaining why they weren't selected. And other times, applicants may not hear back until the company has already hired someone else. Again, depending on the position, there may be a few rounds of interviews, both initial phone screenings and in person. You may have to interview with the recruiter, and other times you may be asked to speak with other members of the department and organization. Remember, you are still interviewing, even when speaking with the receptionist or anyone else in the department. It is your responsibility to protect your brand. Once the company decides you are who they want to hire, you'll be extended an offer. That's basically an overview of the entire process. So let's step back to the beginning. You'll likely be very excited once you are asked to interview, and rightfully so. It's a big moment, and it means that they think you have potential for the role. You don't want to brush it off and go in unprepared. So here's a few tips. 1, reread the job description. You've likely applied to multiple positions, so before the interview, remind yourself about the position and its requirements. You want to tailor your responses and questions to the role to demonstrate that you can make a positive impact on the company through that role. This ties into our second tip. Research the company. What do you know about the company interviewing you? Do you know what it does? Do you know who its competitors are? Do you know where it ranks in the industry? Now, while you don't need to know an entire history, it's important to know what the company stands for so that you can discuss why you want to work there. 3, practice answering questions. While every interview is different and there may be some position-specific questions, most of the questions are standard, so you can be prepared. Almost always, the interviewer will start with, "Tell me about yourself." There will be questions about your strengths and weaknesses, previous work experiences, times when you had to deal with a difficult situation, and more. Since you can't anticipate these, practice how you might answer these questions in advance. Preparing for these questions will also help you make connections between your current experience and the job you're seeking, so that you'll be more prepared to answer other questions. It's a great idea to practice these answers in the mirror and watch your facial expressions and nonverbal cues. People are more inclined to get a good feeling from you when you keep a smile on your face and remain positive, even when speaking to a weakness. When you come across a question that you're not prepared for, which is going to happen, just take your time. Take a breath and think about what you're about to say. It's okay to do that. The silence will kill no one. I also advise using the CAR or STAR method when responding to behavioral-based questions. My personal favorite is the CAR method just because it's a little bit shorter. It stands for circumstance, action, and result. This method will keep your responses concise. You do not want to ramble for 7 minutes to answer one question. This is a testament to your communication skills. And it's okay to say, the circumstance was this. The action I took was this. And the result of that was this. That is okay. And if it keeps you more concise, do it. Next, you'll want to prepare questions to ask. In addition to answering questions, you will be able to ask the interviewer questions. While some of the questions could be answered prior to this portion of the interview, you always want to have a few questions left to ask. So before the interview, create a big enough list so that if some of them are answered, you still have a few to fall back on. Try to create questions that don't have the answers online. If you know who you're interviewing with, take your research one step further and look them up on LinkedIn to learn a few things about them and their background. If truly every question you wrote has been answered, you can always ask about the interviewer's experience with the company and why they enjoy working there. I always have a list of go-to questions for when I interview, just in case they've answered everything else I've prepared. For example, one of my favorites is, based on this interview, where do you see that I could improve for future interviews? Interviewers love this. It's a great way to show your willingness to learn, and it tests them on their coaching and mentoring capabilities. I always pay very close attention to their response, especially if it's someone who's going to be managing me. Because remember, they have to sell themselves on you just as much as you have to sell yourself to them. And lastly, plan your outfit. This might sound silly, but you don't want to be caught on the morning of an interview without anything to wear. And it does happen. Make sure you know the appropriate dress code for the interview, always leaning towards more professional if you don't know. Then be sure the clothes you have fit appropriately and are clean for the big day. Even if your interviewer isn't on site, it is helpful to dress professionally to get yourself in the right mindset. One of my all-time favorite sayings is, dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. There's several ways to purchase appropriate interviewing attire that won't break the bank, especially being part of AKSI with discounts at places like Brooks Brothers and Joseph A. Banks, to name a few. So these are some general tips for any interview. When preparing, trust yourself and do whatever it is you need to do in order to feel confident and comfortable. You know yourself better than anyone else does. So find out what your secret sauce is and execute on that every single time you prepare for an interview, no matter how experienced you become. In addition to these steps, it's also important to talk about the different interview styles, as each one will have its own list of tips to prepare. So let's go through these different styles now. The first type of interview is likely the first one you'll have, a phone interview. First, you'll want to minimize distractions. It may be tempting to just answer the call wherever you are, but the last thing you want is to be in a noisy location that makes it difficult to hear. You will know the time of the interview in advance, so plan to be in an area with minimal distractions, no background noise, and good reception. Fewer distractions means you will be more focused on the interview, and the better they will be able to hear you. Second, you'll want to have your materials ready. The benefit of a phone interview is that you can use notes. Have a copy of your resume and the job description in front of you to reference, but don't script out answers to the common questions we talked about before. Reading a pre-written answer will come across as unnatural. Be yourself and let your personality shine through as much as possible since they can only hear you. But you can use your resume and the job description as a guide. The more you can use the keywords in the description and connect what you've done to what they want, the clearer they will be able to see if you are a good fit for the job. Now, personality can be difficult to show over the phone, so a trick that I use during phone interviews is to look at myself in a small mirror on my desk or wherever I'm at. I'm aware that this sounds very strange, but when you can watch yourself and try to keep a smile on your face while you're talking, the easier it will be to demonstrate your personality. And third, speak up and be clear. This should go without saying, but on a phone interview, be sure to speak up. Pay attention to your volume because you want them to be able to hear and understand what you're saying. Standing up during a phone interview will help you feel more confident. When you're sitting, you're likely in a comfortable position, which can affect the way you speak. The next type of interview you might encounter is a video interview. Now, video interviews can be used in a couple of different ways. Some cases may be an initial interview where they ask you to conduct a self-recorded video using a specialized software with provided questions. In other cases, the company may want to engage with you beyond a phone interview. But if you live too far away, doing a video interview can be a compromise. When it comes to video interviews, everything we mentioned for a phone interview still applies, but now the interviewers can also see you. So first, you'll want to clean up the area or set the stage. Just as we said with the phone interviews, you don't want to be somewhere noisy with anything in the background. Now that they can see you, you also don't want to be somewhere that has anything visually disrupting in the background. You may be limited on where you can do your interview. So if you can't utilize a quiet workroom on campus, you may have to do it at home. If so, that's okay, but make sure there is adequate lighting, a strong internet signal, and you don't have random items in view behind you. You want the interviewers to focus on what you're saying, not the things around you. You should know what platform will host the interview, like Zoom or Skype, so try it out ahead of time to figure out lighting and audio reception in multiple locations. It's always good to have a backup in mind in case someone else needs the space or the internet is acting up. Next, dress professionally. On phone interviews, professional dress is optional, but on video, it's required. Oftentimes, people will try to get away with only dressing professionally on top and wearing comfy bottoms, but I strongly advise against that. What happens if you're having issues with the internet and you need to move? Do you want your interviewer to see your pajama pants when you stand up? I doubt it. Keep all possibilities in mind and prepare for them in advance. Third, watch your body language. Some people have very strong body language and will talk with their hands more than they realize. In person, it may not be that distracting, but when you are on camera, your interviewer will notice. So try to keep your hand gestures to a minimum and pay attention to your body language. Sit up straight and maintain eye contact as best you can by looking into the camera and not at the screen. Finally, speak up and be clear. We already said the same for phone interviews, but I'll repeat it again. Speak up and speak clearly. If your interviewer has to ask, especially if they have to ask more than once, it means they can't hear why they should hire you. The last type of interview is an in-person interview. Typically, this is one of the last rounds of an interview process. If a company brings you on site, the company could seriously be considering you as a candidate. So you're going to want to get details ahead of time. If you've never been to the location before, be sure to get details about where you're going, where to park, and what to bring. The last thing you want is to be late and make a bad first impression. If being late makes you nervous, map out the route in advance and drive there a few days before to see what the traffic will be like and how much time you need. You should always plan for more time, as you never know when there may be an accident or a light out. Figuring out the optimal route in advance is only going to help you the morning of the interview. I personally always drive to the location a few days before, just so that I'm familiar with the route. When you get to this stage of the interview process, they may also expect you to bring samples in or a portfolio in addition to your resume. Even if they don't ask, it's worth it to bring samples, particularly for any design-related position. If you know you are being interviewed by 2 people, bring 4 copies of your portfolio. You always want to have enough just in case someone additional is pulled into the interview unexpectedly. If this is your second or third interview, still bring your portfolio. Do not assume that they still have the original one that you left with them. Next, observe your surroundings. While on site, observe how employees interact with one another, what the environment is like, and the general feel of the organization. Do the people seem friendly and inviting, or does everyone keep their heads down? What is the office space like? A cubicle or your own office? Do you see yourself working there? Does this place seem like it's well kept or messy? If you receive an offer, do you feel like it's a good fit for you? If it doesn't feel like a good fit, it's better to make that decision before you accept an offer. I cannot stress this point enough. It is a mutual evaluation. They need to sell you on their company just as much as you need to sell them on you. Listen to your gut feeling with this because it's usually correct. Lastly, sell yourself. Usually when a company brings you on site, you've already had some contact through either a phone interview or a Skype interview. If they've already seen your resume and are really looking to see how you present yourself. So sell yourself, your personality, and your abilities in order to have the best chance at an offer. Remember, the interview starts as soon as you pull into that parking lot. In addition to these tips, sometimes your on-site interviews are going to include multiple people, whether it's multiple interviewers or even multiple candidates. A panel interview is when you are interviewed by more than one interviewer at a time. This is a way for the organization to have people from different departments or multiple members of the same department interact with you without taking up more of your time or theirs. So for this, you'll want to prepare ahead of time. You will likely know in advance that you are meeting with multiple people, so be sure to bring enough copies of your resume. If you have their names, look them up on the company website or LinkedIn to have an idea of who they are and their background. This can decrease nerves and help you create questions. Next, make sure you involve everyone. While only one person at a time will ask a question, try to have eye contact with each interviewer and speak to them as a group. Only one asks the question, but everyone evaluates your answer. Some will likely speak more than others, but make sure to give some time and attention to each person as they will all be providing feedback to the hiring manager. When the interview ends, make sure to ask each interviewer if they have any additional questions for you. Lastly, you'll want to follow up with everyone. After the interview, as I'll mention again on the next slide, follow up with each person who interviews you. You may not get a business card from each person, so be sure to ask. If you can't get each person's information, you can send a thank you note to the individual who scheduled the interview and ask them to pass along the message. I always advise sending a follow-up thank you email to each interviewer the moment you get back to your car. Then I also suggest sending a handwritten thank you note in the mail the next day. This may sound cheesy and old school, but it does go a long way. Now we will move on to group interviews. A group interview is conducted by only 1 or 2 interviewers, but multiple candidates are interviewed at the same time. This often occurs in retail positions or when a company needs to hire more than one person for the same role. So, tips here. Don't be intimidated. Pay attention to how the other candidates present themselves and their experiences, but do not let them intimidate you. The other candidates may have impressive resumes and experiences, but so do you. Focus on what you bring to the table and why you are interested in the job. Don't worry about outshining someone else because you don't know why the interviewers brought in each of you. Remember, you were chosen for a reason, and being part of AKSI gives you an advantage over other candidates. So be confident in yourself. As stated already, the company may be looking to hire more than one of you, or the other person may be applying for a different position, and this is simply another way for them to get exposure to the company. So focus on yourself and your goals. Second, build on their ideas. How you answer a question isn't always about the answer itself, but more about your thought process. Building off another candidate's answer not only shows that you are a good listener, but it also demonstrates that you can hear an idea and take it one step further. Express your knowledge of the industry and position, and utilize soft skills to give the interviewers even more. And finally, be personable. The employer may end up hiring more than one of you, so use this as an opportunity to evaluate the types of people in consideration, some of whom could be your coworkers. Do the interviewers and the other candidates seem like people you might want to work with? Let the interviewers see your personality and how you're going to interact with others. In group and panel interviews, it may seem intimidating with so many people in the room at once, but remember why you are there and stay focused on the goal, selling yourself and moving to the next stage of the interview process and ultimately getting an offer. As mentioned earlier, each company has a different interview process. So before you end the interview, it's important to ask about the next step. The interviewers may walk you through the next few stages, or they might just provide a time frame of when you can expect to hear back. Do not leave that room without next steps and business cards from the interviewers. If they give you a time frame, take note of it, but also leave them a little wiggle room. Things often come up, so if they haven't reached out by that date, it doesn't mean they're ignoring you. Give them another day or two before reaching out. If they're vague, it's typically in your best interest to wait 1 to 2 weeks before reaching out. Remember, you are most likely not their biggest priority due to other responsibilities, but don't be afraid to reach out. If they tell you they will get back to you by end of the day Friday and you don't hear from them, send them an email just to reestablish the timeline and reiterate your interest in the position. Regardless of the next steps, you always want to send a thank you note within 24 to 48 hours of your interview. It is not required to send one by mail, though it's always a nice touch. In a thank you, be sure to personalize it and send one to everyone you met. If there was something you forgot to mention in the interview, now is the time to add it. Just as your first impression makes an impact, this will likely be the last interaction a company has with you before making a decision, so you want to make it count. Before we move into questions, let's recap what we've talked about so far. First, preparation is key. And while there are several great tips, trust yourself and know what you need to do in order to feel confident going into an interview. You know you best. Next, depending on the type of interview, your focus and preparation may look a little bit different. Be sure to get all of the facts ahead of time so that you can be prepared. Lastly, every company will have a slightly different interview process. So you always want to give them a bit of extra time to respond. Focus on what you can control, which is your performance in the interview and your follow-up.
Thank you, Bailey, for offering so many great tips and resources for our viewers today. And as they begin to think of questions for you, I'd like to highlight the key skills that we discussed today. Members will gain organization, research, confidence, and analytical and critical thinking skills as they prepare for interviews. Members will also gain relationship building, confidence, and oral communication skills as they begin participating in interviews. Members will also gain experience with written communication when they engage in follow-up emails or notes after the interview. And at this point, we are going to transition to questions. As stated earlier, please launch the Q&A widget from the menu dock to submit those questions. If we don't get to your question now, we will respond via email, and this feature will remain open in on-demand viewing. So to get us started, our first question, I've never been interviewed before. How can I practice beforehand?
Hi, yeah, so that is a great question. If you've never been interviewed before, I highly suggest practicing with maybe a mentor, a professor, or maybe even a friend. It's a great idea to sit down with them or call them via the phone and just go over some of those more common questions and just practice your answering. That's typically what I would suggest doing if you've never been interviewed before.
Absolutely. And moving on to our next question, what are some things I should never say or talk about during an interview?
Yeah, so the big ones to stay away from during an interview definitely are going to be the hot button topics like politics, religion, um, anything like that. I would stay away from age and family background, all of that stuff. That can just open you up to, a lot of biases prior to even finishing the interview process.
All right. And our next question, how can I avoid referencing the same one or two experiences for each question if I don't have a lot of other experience?
Yeah, so this is a great one. I personally, prior to having several experiences and internships, I always use AKSI as my biggest example. And even if I came back to it, I would just say something along the lines of, AKSI has been the best experience for me because it gave me the opportunity to have lots of these different scenarios that you're mentioning. I apologize for continuing to use this example, but it really is the best way for me to showcase my abilities to you.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
how I would handle that one.
Yeah, and our next question is a really good one. I'm getting a lot of phone interviews, but nothing's further. So what advice do you have to kind of get to the next stage?
So phone interviews can be tough. That's one where you really need to let your personality come out. So like I mentioned earlier, I think it's a great idea in practice to watch yourself in the mirror. And I know it sounds super weird, but watch yourself in the mirror and make sure you keep a smile on your face the whole time that you're talking to this person, because it usually makes you come off, a little bit more personable. And then also don't get off the phone until you've asked them what the next steps are, or you've gained a timeline, you've established a timeline of when you need to follow up with them, and always get their information and send them an email immediately after the phone interview.
Right. And Bailey, you had mentioned those hot button topics. So what should they do if the interviewer asks a question like that about their age or children or family background, things like that?
You can always just handle that by saying, you don't feel that that's pertinent to the interview. You can say something like that, or you can say, I feel my experience speaks for itself. I don't feel that that's really relevant. That's usually how I would handle that, but most interviewers are not going to ask you questions like that anyways, just because they can, that's an HR problem.
Mm-hmm. All right, and our next question, what should I do if the interviewer asks a question that, if I answer truthfully, will cause them to kind of reject me? Like, why you left your last job, or why there's a gap in employment, things like that.
Yeah, so that's a great one. I personally always try to find a way to spin that. So I think that's a really good one for you to talk to somebody about and try to both brainstorm a way that you could make that seem more positive than it is if it really is negative. But even if you have something negative to say of, your flag and experience or whatever, when you're talking to somebody, it's always better to be truthful. But you can always say things like, try to make it positive towards the end of it by saying, yes, I left my previous job because I didn't get along with my manager. However, moving forward, I've taken several, personality tests, and I'm making myself more knowledgeable of my behaviors moving forward.
All right, and our last question for this program. I applied to a position I didn't quite think I was qualified for, but they actually want to do an interview. How should I prepare for that?
So that's a great one. I've actually had this happen to me before as well. Obviously, they thought you were qualified in the first place, or they wouldn't be talking to you. And the best way to prepare for that one is really pretty much everything we went through earlier. You know, go back and read the job description, do your research online, learn as much as you can about what you would be doing, about the company, and try to just be super knowledgeable on that piece and try to figure out different ways to tie your experience to that job description. And then always, always, always do your LinkedIn research and figure out who you're interviewing with. You can even see some other individuals that work at that company, and you can look at their backgrounds and see, you know, if they have similar backgrounds to you or what their backgrounds look like, and you can kind of build yourself off of that for the interview. And I would practice, as always.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, those are all the questions we have. Is there any other, final thoughts or last pieces of advice you'd like to share, Bailey?
Yeah, I think my best piece of advice is to be confident in an interview. Just remember that you were chosen for a reason, and you have a lot to bring to the table. Even just being a member of AKSI, you have a lot to bring to the table. You're already a step above, your peers. So just be confident in that when you're talking to people. Have a good attitude about everything, and always, always, always follow up. And that's really the best advice I can give for interviews.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bailey, for joining us today. But that's all the time we have. For our viewers, be sure to check out the resource list to access more information about the job search process, as well as more AKSI webinars and blogs. For any follow-up questions or conversation about this program, please contact education@aksi.org.